this email? What does it mean?
Communication is the imparting or exchanging of information or
The
news.
single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place.
Conversation is the oral exchange of sentiments, observations, opinions, or ideas.
Forbes Books Radio presents The Conversation with Clinton M. Padgett.
Welcome back to my conversation with James Williams, VP of Olympic Assets and Marketing for the Tokyo 2020+1 Olympic Games. James, one of the things I think you do brilliantly is how you leverage each event as an on-the-job training opportunity for the next major event. You guys as an organization actually have the vision and are willing to incur the expense of bringing key team members from the next global event over and having them work during the current event. They then, of course, gain valuable firsthand knowledge of the issues and complications involved. They're able to take their key learnings and working knowledge back to their respective teams, most of which had never participated in a big global event like this. I just think that's brilliant.
Yeah, no, exactly. Well, that was all until 2020, and then it all got a little bit out of kilter because Beijing's going to start 6 months after Tokyo's finished. So that's kind of put a bit of a slap on that one because we can't actually. It was really interesting. I was chatting to someone just generally as an industry. Is that has been the case. There's a lot of people outside of Coke, but just within the events industry that jump from event to event, especially in the hospitality industry or something like that. And that's going to be the challenge for us next year, is people aren't going to have that downtime before they're bouncing straight into the next event. And it's something that we've started to talk about across various people, like, okay, that's going to be tough because you're going to finish, you're literally going to have packed up Tokyo, and you're going to be heading to Beijing to plan an event that's going to be happening in 5 months. So I think it's going to be really interesting about how we all adapt to that and how we all try and manage that, and also manage people in that, because there's a real danger that you increase that chance of burnout. In a challenging environment, you get more people, the mental stress. Games and events are mentally stressful. So we need to make sure that we keep an eye on those people across the industry. So I think that's going to be an important one for next year.
I think what makes the torch relay unique is that it is such a grind for so many days straight, whereas on the preparation for the Olympic Games themselves, obviously you've got the 17 days of the games or whatever the period of time is. That's not the same as 70 straight days, plus all the planning that went into that in advance. So you've got a lot more work, and it's really a grind that you have a different challenge, I think, for the events themselves, because you do start planning so far in advance. People are super excited in the beginning. Oh, we're going to be part of the Olympics. And then of course the games happen and they're excited, but there's a long time in the middle where the excitement kind of lags, and you've got to motivate to keep the excitement level up.
Yeah, no, that's so true. And actually, when I talk about my relay in London, I had kind of like a bit of a short one, essentially, because if you think Vancouver was 106 days, Russia was 123, Rio was 95. Like, that's a long time to keep the pace up. Now, I can argue they weren't all full days and things like that, but it's about keeping that energy going for all that time is tough. And as you say, trying to keep that in between pieces is part of the momentum. I think that's where you start to really understand that it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. I think that analogy plays so well. One I've started to use again here, because we're supposed to have finished the marathon and we're going to have to start a new one. So, but yeah, it is exactly that kind of piece.
I have to imagine that since we're referencing Bill Murray movies, I'm guessing that felt like Groundhog Day.
That's definitely what I've used at the moment, especially from a planning point of view. You'd appreciate this. It's like, hang on a second, I've done this all before a couple of years ago. So yeah, it definitely, recently it's felt a little bit like Groundhog Day.
No, yeah, exactly. So how is Japan handling COVID? What's it been like there?
I think honestly, and I apologize to your listeners, but actually we've been really lucky here in Japan. In having seen and heard, especially back in Europe, my home country and stuff like that, and seeing what's happened in the US and stuff like that, it's affected us very differently here. And I think that's a nature of just the level of I don't know, discipline, but the culture here in Japan is there's no real hugging or shaking of hands. It's all bowing. So it's a low touch economy anyway. And everyone wears masks. You know, it's a normal thing in winter. And if you've got a cold, you'll wear a mask because you don't want to hand over the illness. So culturally, it was built in here to be a lot more resilient to it. So we haven't felt the same level as lockdowns that we've seen across the world, which in some respects is a good thing and also a great thing for the games. I did remember though when we did the test event for the torch relay actually in March, February, March this year, obviously preparing for the real torch relay. So yeah, it was in February, and it was quite a strange one because I remember taking a photo because the street was just lined with everyone wearing masks. And I was like, wow, this is going to make for such a different torch relay. All these photo moments are just going to have everyone's no smiling faces, just everyone's got masks. So I do think it's a good country in that respect to host the games because the level of detail and how much they'll do to look after everyone, I think is going to be good.
I think from my perspective, I'm a big fan of Japan. I've always enjoyed my time there. And part of that's because as a planner, I like to follow rules. And so they follow rules very well there. But it's phenomenal to me. You think about a city like Tokyo, which actually has more people than the country of Canada. And yet they've been able to survive this pandemic very well, thanks to the things you're talking about. The fact that it's a low touch economy, that they do wear their masks long before. When I first went there, I would ask people, why do we have a mask? Am I supposed to be wearing one? And it was no, they either they don't want to get sick or they have it, don't want to spread it to you. So it's a kindness thing. So there's hope. If a city is densely compact, as close together as Tokyo can do this, I'd like to think the rest of us can do this at some point here. So.
Yeah, no, I agree. And it's one of the, and it's really interesting because when we were talking about that kind of over-planned culture, is the ability for them to adapt is always challenging. Like I said, changing things here isn't easy, but within this environment, I was really impressed with how quickly certain things, like just on a basic level, restaurants where you could never get takeout and stuff like that, they suddenly very quickly in about 4 weeks adapted to being able to pick up your food or order it and things like that, which for me was great. It was great to see, for me, a culture that is very hard to changing quite rapidly. So I think that it was really good. And I also think the Japanese have a really high level of resilience. I think this comes from all the various different natural disasters they have. They kind of deal with it, just get on with it. It's one of the things that's really impressed me over the summer. You know, they're just this get on and deal with it kind of attitude. There's no messing around. You're just like, okay, fine. So we've got to deal with this. Let's do it. It's really impressed me actually over the summer.
So to put it in your terms, it would be stiff upper lip. Is that it? Just gotta keep it going.
Yes, exactly. Yes, stiff upper lip. That's all. Come on, let's go. Yeah.
One of the questions that I get asked a lot domestically about international work is, there's this assumption that in Japan, for instance, people are afraid to ask questions or say anything if their boss is in the room. And I'm just curious, is that a stereotype or is that actually what you experience as well?
Yeah, it's definitely not a stereotype here in Japan. There is a massive hierarchy. There's a big thing about what they call is nemawashi. So you have to go around and had pre-conversations about this. And before you can get to a meeting, everyone's supposed to have talked about it. So actually the leaders don't have to do much. They just sign the form and it's all agreed. So yes, and the one that we've had a real struggle with recently, and one that I've tried to change and create environment, is just a very open, honest, and transparent environment, which I don't think has been normal here. A lot of my team took a while for the adjustment to happen to, look, you can give me feedback. That's the idea of it. And we weren't getting much of it. So we've created these different ways that people can give feedback and respond to how things are going. But it takes a long time in those kind of meetings for people to talk out. Which is a real shame. The hierarchy, there's a lot of that hierarchy, the age, there's still quite a lot of sexism and that kind of stuff, which I which does make it a challenging environment. But then I think you get so much more reward out of it when you see it shift to actually people starting to ask questions or challenging. That's the other one. Is even in Brazil, you never really challenged your boss. That was a bad thing. I made that mistake a couple of times. But here I actively, openly encourage them to challenge me on my thinking, especially when it's about the local environment, because they know it better than me. And that's why I need them to. That's what I pay them for. That's why I keep telling them, look, I pay you to tell me how to do things better in this culture. I'm here to kind of guide you to get things in the right direction. And that's where we form some good partnerships. So
I think obviously the topic of conversation of this podcast is the conversation. And you could argue that when we come over and do these massive planning events, the value is in the conversations that are fostered and facilitated. And I'm just wondering, for me, I see a lot of one-way communications through email or text, and you lose something, right? You lose the tone, you lose the visual. Like you and I are recording this audio, but I'm looking at you so I can see your reaction to a question, or if I need to repeat it, et cetera. And you lose that in the one-way communications. And I was wondering, is that even more important when you're working in a cross-cultural environment where you have the language barrier already? Is it more important to have the conversation, or is just the text, based communications the way to go?
The easy answer to that one is conversation. You can get things so out of context. People can respond and write to things quickly in text messages or emails, and you can miss a whole world of that piece of communication. And even now, even with text messages, when you've got autocorrect, you can get a very different message across without even implying it. So for me, and it's also, as you say, that even now, when we talk about lockdown at the moment, and we've now suddenly all moved into this Zoom world and video conferencing, one of the things, whilst we get this kind of Zoom fatigue, it's still important to see people, because if you don't really understand what they're talking about. You don't really have the ability to read a bit of body language and things like that. And I think that allows you in a conversation, a one-on-one conversation, to dig deeper into the understanding. And for me, you've got to better understand where someone's coming from. The more you can understand where someone's coming from, the better the output of what you're trying to do, because it's not just about you. It's about really understanding both sides of where the people are coming from. And you can really only do that when you give it time, which ironically, you go back to Brazil, that's exactly what they do. They spend time in making sure that relationship works. So yeah, I would definitely favor conversations over other forms of communication.
I think the way that the story that I like to use to describe that is, in the US, we call the game telephone as a kid. I believe somebody told me that in the UK, it's probably called Chinese whispers, but you have a group of, 4, 5, 6 kids in a row, and you tell a secret, and each person tells that secret. And of course, the fun in the game is that what comes out of the last person's mouth is not remotely close to what person number one said. And the reason that happens, I believe, is each individual person, if I now bring us back into present day, that same scenario, each individual person hears the message through their filter, their bias, their life experience, the way they define terms. And they then twist the message slightly based on their understanding to the next person who twists it yet again. So it's no surprise that what comes out of person number 6, the message is completely mangled. Where you can avoid that and get your message to be consistent throughout the organization, or in this case, throughout the game, is if you have a conversation where each individual person could turn back to the previous person and ask clarifying questions. Well, what does that word mean? Because here's what I think it means. Is that what you think it means? And when you say left, you mean like right now, or the McDonald's 2 blocks up? And then you get the right message that gets communicated on down the line. So I do think the conversation, especially if language is a barrier, I think it's even more important that we have this back and forth where I can tell whether or not you're understanding, what I'm saying.
Yeah, and I think especially when you talk about this day and age, listening skills. I was recently asked this question recently. What's the one thing that I want to work on? And the one thing I want to be better at is focusing my listening and my attention, because these days you got so many bleeps, emails and stuff like this when you're on especially these days when you're on conference calls and stuff like that. I'm starting to get better at turning off my notifications on things like that, because you don't always hear everything that's going on because there's so much noise. So if you don't have that conversation, you don't ask that question, you're not really going to know what it is. So you've assumed a couple of things, you've plugged a few points, and suddenly you're building something very different to what the person wanted. And I think that's also, I think, with even in those written communications now, when we talk, whether it's presentations, whether it's emails and things like that, is teaching people to be a lot more focused on that as well. I mean, and you know Marcel, he's a good friend of ours. He loves a really long email. And I'm like, mate, dude, just bullet point it. If you just make it more succinct, and then you're not going to, because if that's a lot to read for people. So I think we've all got to find a way to make sure that we get across the right things. And I think conversations, phone calls are so much easier to cut that. It's one of the things my team, I think, probably hate that I do is they'll say, oh, so-and-so wants to do this, this, and this. And I'm like, really? That doesn't make any sense. Why are they asking to do that? And they're like, well, that's what he told me. And then I pick up the phone. I go, hey, is this what you meant? And they're like, no, that's nothing what I meant. And I'm like, okay, great, thanks. And then I'll recount it back. And they hate that because I pick up the phone, but it gets me to the answer of what I need to know before we've wasted a lot of time doing stuff we didn't need to do.
So much the one-way communications, it just, you're back and forth as opposed to just cutting to the chase, picking up the phone, walking down the hallway, whatever, getting right to the gist of it. Right. I think that's so important. One of the questions that I'm often asked is what makes a person good at conversation? And I think the two things that come to mind for me, at least, and I'm curious to get your feedback, is, we have a saying where I grew up that you have two ears and one mouth. You should use them in that ratio, right? You need to listen more than you talk, or you're not having a conversation. And I don't want this to digress into the political environment, but I think a lot of what we see in the world today is nobody's listening. We're just hurling epithets at each other from behind our foxholes instead of actually having the conversation and hearing what you say. I don't have to agree with it. Just hear that you have that point of view. And I think the other thing that makes us good conversationalists is, as you just said, be in the moment. Put down the cell phone, make the eye contact. At least, again, not agreeing with your point of view. I'm just saying that I hear you. What you're saying is important for me to hear. And I think that's what those two things together, I think, can make conversations really powerful.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think that's one of the things I've definitely taught myself is to play back to someone here. So just let me explain. This is what I've heard. And I think even when we talk about that, we could use the example of when you and I did the planning here, when we were doing master planning at the beginning. Wow, that was a lot of conversations to get to a point as to how we were going to be able to move forward within people who had a very different point of view. And there was a lot of backwards and forwards in that. And I think, as you say, that's why we've got to do it. And I think you're right. I just think generally, and I know I'm conscious of it, that we don't always listen. I'm telling you, my wife will tell you a million times that I don't listen. She'll just tell me straight up, you're not listening to me. And you're like, yes, I'm in my phone. I'm sorry, I will turn my phone off. So we do need to get better at it. And I think in the current environment, I think that's the thing that's going to be difficult. And when you talk about that in the political environment, as you were saying, is that's maybe what's exacerbating the situations. When we start to get into the Twitter and the Facebooks and all this kind of stuff, and there's so much stuff just spewing out there that we're not stopping and thinking, really? Okay, let's just see if this is exactly what everyone's talking about.
I think what you said that I really, really resonated with me and I agree with is you put it back and say, here's what I think I heard. And I think that's important anywhere, but certainly in a cross-cultural situation where there's a language barrier and the nuances, that makes so much sense to say, well, here's what I think you're telling me. Is that what you mean? And probably how often you are surprised when they go, no, that's not what I meant.
Yeah, it makes so much difference to the conversation because it allows them to correct things. And especially in difficult conversations, some people won't have already thought, and especially in Japan, because they want to pre-think everything. So they don't really want to give you an answer until they've thought about it 15 times. So therefore, what they do is it gives them to rethink their answer as well. So you're going, have I got this right? Let me ask you again. Is this what you need? And then they'll rethink it again. Oh, yeah. And I've started to do it. I've got a lot better at it. I'm still not perfect at it. Probably won't be for many years, but I'm a man we're just taught not to listen.
So I was teaching a class at Georgia Tech, and this was last year. And actually, I guess it was the beginning of this year because COVID was happening. And somebody said, do you think they're going to delay the Olympics? And I was adamant, this is never going to happen. You know, people, sponsors have spent all this money and athletes have trained. So clearly I was surprised. I was just curious, since you were there in it, were you surprised at all that the games got moved?
I don't know. I guess to a point in your mind, you were like, we've worked so long and hard on this. And for us, it was quite an interesting one because for most people, the games, they think of July, but as we've talked about, the torch relay starts so much further in advance. So we were actually, at the breakout of COVID, we were in Greece, lighting the flame in Olympia and bringing it back to Japan to start the torch relay at the end of March. So we were in this kind of weird world where we were kind of, let's go. And there was 3 of us, we'd gone out there and we were there with the delegation as Europe was literally shutting down. Like it was the countries with flights you weren't allowed in. And I always felt like we were the last flight out of Greece kind of thing, which was a weird feeling. So did I think, I honestly don't think, I did think it was going to get cancelled because I felt that we had time until July to fix it. But when we looked at it properly for the torch relay and everything like this, and I believe the IOC and the Japanese government and TOCOG made the right decision. We needed to delay it. Yes, is it a challenge for everyone involved? 100%. But it's the right thing to do for people's safety. And that's, whether we like it or not, that's the right thing to do. We've got to protect people first before anything else comes before that. So yeah, I can't say I thought about it, and I have to say it's been a roller coaster year since then of trying to work out what we're doing, how we're going to do it, when are we going to do it, if we're going to do it, will it happen, don't know. And still to this point, I mean, whilst we have a lot of confidence in the games and the games will happen, it's going to be a very different games. And that's going to be the really interesting thing. And it was interesting when you said about Groundhog Day. It is Groundhog Day, but it's just slightly different because, you know, you're having to think about things that you haven't prepared for, whether it's social distancing, whether it's about all the COVID restrictions, planning for that in the hope that actually by next July, we're all in a whole different world and everything's back to normal. And I still believe in that, and I still hope that will be the case. So all of the planning we're doing now might be wasted, but we're going to do it and make sure that we do the right thing for people who want to come and enjoy the games.
Yeah, when I was thinking about Groundhog Day, I was thinking about your torch relay. You know, every day you wake up and it's the same thing over and over again, right? And that's also a little nugget you threw out there that not everybody realizes is the flame that gets run is actually from Greece. You guys fly over and light it and bring that flame back. I guess, is it called the mother flame or something like that?
Yeah, mother flame, and then there is little daughter flames. Has the seat 1A on the plane coming back.
There you go.
And coming back from London, I think the Princess Royal, the flame out-seated the Princess Royal and David Beckham. So they had to sit back, whereas the flame got the prime seat. That's how important the flame is.
That's awesome. I didn't even know you could have open flames on planes, so that's good to know. So
I think there's a lot of paperwork to get through that one.
Well, I've only got 2 questions left. I think you've already answered the one, but I'll ask it anyway, is what challenges has the delay presented? And obviously you've alluded to the fact that there's lots of planning that's now going on that may indeed be wasted, but it's one of the things I always tell people when they use that as an excuse, well, the plan's it's going to change. So what, your solution is to not have a plan? I mean, you have to have a plan that you can change from and adjust from. And so clearly that's one challenge you guys are having is how do you do the social distancing piece? What's the audience attendance going to look like when the games actually do happen? Are there any other challenges that really this delay of +1 is represented or hit you with?
Well, I think overall it makes you have to relook at, and I was talking to someone about this, and when we got to probably about April this year, May, and that was when it was like, okay, right, we were having to rethink the team. We were having to push resources. You can't just keep another team that was up to pretty much full capacity for another year when we're not sure what we're doing for the next 6 to 9 months. And we were pretty much a go date. I mean, the torch relay team were literally on a bus about to drive up to Fukushima where they were going to kick off. And that's a bunch of people, there's 70 odd people. They were already got their bags, got their uniforms ready to go. And we had to put pause. So I think that's the bit where, for us, we needed to really stop, pause, and reflect. We had to relook at what our objectives were. What were we trying to achieve? What we're going to be able to achieve? And then the other one was just scenario plan. And again, when I talk about the stakeholders, then you've got to try and align every single stakeholder that's going to feel like we've just invested all this money and we've lost it. So it was a whole plan within that where we had to replan against a different set of criteria. I will be quite grateful. I'm hoping that when I do another event, if I do another event after this, that I don't have to write as many scenario plans, because right now I have a scenario plan for pretty much any kind of. Previously, we used to do IMCR, Incident Management Crisis Resolution training, which would be all the stuff like, okay, there's going to be a bomb, or there's this threat, or there's that threat. We have a whole document on on pandemics now. So this it's also going to be the first clause we put in a contract, and it'll be like, okay, so before we get into anything, where's your pandemic clause? So it has put in a lot of challenges, but in a very different way. And for me, the challenge was about that. You talked about the motivation and that momentum before, and it's the people piece. And trying to keep, so the mental health side of stuff is being tough within this environment anyway. And then you've got this whole change within people's jobs. Is it going to happen? Isn't it? What's going to happen to my future? So you've really got to try and keep that, and also the motivation of like, yes, I'm still working on a major event. So I think that's the piece, and the challenge for me personally, I think for my team, was to really try and make sure they were looked after. They got through this and they were still motivated to run out and do it again. You know, our torch relay team has now had to pick itself up again. We're starting to do lantern tours at the end of this year. So then you throw in something completely new like that, which we've never planned for doing a lantern tour before. And now we're doing 10 of them here in Japan.
What's a lantern tour?
So the lantern tour is where the flames, so you talked about the mother flames, they live in a little lantern, and that's what keeps them alive. And everywhere you go with, you always have that flame. So it's always the same flame that you use everywhere. And we're going to tour that around the country with the organizing committee. The organizing committee are going around the different prefectures, which are like states, I guess, in the US. And they're going to do that. And and so people can touch it. Again, you're trying to build that momentum within a country and a world that's kind of is not in a great place. So you've got to try and build that hope. There's got to be hope for people to look for. So if we can try and do that within this country and get it round to some of the little places and see people this hope in the form of a flame before the relay starts, I think is going to be amazing.
Well, I think you touched on it, but to me, the biggest challenge you have is you said, it's a marathon, and then you see the finish line in sight, and all of a sudden they moved it another 26 miles, and so you're like, so there's already the motivation of the lag of, this is a 3+ year project for some people, and there's that lag in the middle where they start to lose motivation, and then you're back up and you're right there, and now it's gone. So that challenge had to be, on the people side, had to be tough to get them, you get their energy levels up and to get the motivation up and to keep their positivity up when they were right there and the goalpost got moved. That's got to be one of the tougher challenges, I would imagine.
Yeah. And it has been. I mean, to this point, this would be about the time I would be packing up and would be going off to the next place. We would have been leaving Japan about in a normal year. And you're right. And the other thing is not so much, there's also people who have stayed and working on the game. So there's also a whole world of people who now don't have jobs, who were working on the games, who have either lost that job and therefore will never deliver the games. So I think mentally, just generally outside, we need to make sure that we are capturing those people, we are looking after them, we are making sure that they've got the care and attention that they need, because it's tough. It's going to be tough. It's been tough on everyone.
For sure. So last question, do you have any funny anecdotes or cringeworthy stories that you can share based on, your time on these multi-global events?
I think there were many, and I don't want to pick on Brazil, but there was definitely some great fun times in Brazil. And I think one of the best things about Brazil was the games. I think again, this comes to this manana kind of culture, and things get done eventually, and they were definitely all done and ready for the Paralympics. Maybe not so much for the Olympics. And I remember we were going round on a site visit. So this is literally about a day before the opening. So we go around, we see all the stadiums and the different areas that we're working in, and we're walking around. And there was this one area up in Diadora, which was up in the north of Brazil, and we were up one of the stadiums up there. And in the spectator area, you know how normally you find these things going, it's a map of the whole area, so you know where you are. And there's a big sign that says, "You are here." The big arrow. So you can see this from "You are here." And underneath it, there's normally a map of where you are, so you know where to get to. The only thing is, in Brazil, they'd forgotten to put the map there. So all you had was this pillar with this massive arrow pointing down going, "You are here." There's a photo of me and a few colleagues just with this photo of the six of us underneath this sign just going, "You are here," which without any context, any map or any use whatsoever, it was just a big arrow that said, "You are here." Again, not something that someone obviously thought through too well, or they forgot about the map, but it was there for the whole of the Olympics. I think they did replace it in the Paralympics. I think they actually put a map underneath it.
Just minor details.
Yeah, it was definitely one of the funniest days I've had for a while.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah. James, I know you're a busy guy, man. I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy day to have this conversation with me.
Well, it's a pleasure to speak to you and see you. And I wish you all the best over in the US, and especially with the election and everything like that. So yeah, and great to talk to you. And hopefully I'll see you again in a few months.
I hope so. Thanks, James.
Cool. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to The Conversation with Clinton M. Padgett. To find out more about Clint, go to projectsuccess.com or pick up Clint's book, The Project Success Method, at amazon.com. This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio.